In 1941, as the United States entered the war, the officers of the Wehrmacht were certain of their victory. They saw the American military as an inexperienced force, ill-prepared for the brutal realities of battle. German officers dismissed the U.S. Army as lacking not only the tactical experience, but also a clear strategy to match the precision and discipline of the Wehrmacht. To them, the arrival of American troops would only slow down the inevitable German triumph. This overconfidence came from their battlefield success, their superior technology, and their deep belief in the infallibility of the German war machine. But in reality, this would prove to be a massive miscalculation. The Germans underestimated the Americans' capacity to adapt and innovate. In their view, the U.S. Army was a force that lacked cohesion and experience, particularly in Europe's complex theaters of war. However, this assumption was flawed. The American forces, though initially struggling, were soon learning from their mistakes. Their tactical flexibility, when combined with sheer determination, proved to be far more effective than the Germans anticipated. The Wehrmacht officers could not fathom that, despite the U.S. Army's lack of experience, they would quickly develop a strategic and coordinated approach that would shake the very foundations of German superiority. This failure to assess their enemy properly would haunt the Wehrmacht as they faced increasingly sophisticated American tactics in battles that were to come. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Also, share your location and the time you're watching this in the comments below. Let's connect across time and space. When the United States entered the war in 1941, the American military was far from ready. Their forces were still recovering from the Great Depression, and the military infrastructure had not yet reached the scale needed for the global conflict they had just been thrust into. The U.S. had a long history of isolationism, and it showed in the struggles their forces faced early on. Soldiers arriving on the front lines were often inexperienced and unprepared for the brutalities of war. Their training was rushed, and the military was scrambling to catch up to the efficiency of the German and Japanese forces, who had been at war for years. The initial months were a period of intense struggle. The U.S. Army faced logistical challenges, coordination issues between branches, and a lack of a cohesive strategy. As the Americans fought in North Africa, they learned painful lessons about combat. One of the first being that numbers alone couldn't win a battle. Early operations saw heavy losses and confusion as American forces attempted to face the highly trained Wehrmacht troops. The Americans, still learning the ropes of modern warfare, were often outmaneuvered and overpowered by German forces. But despite these early setbacks, the Americans were beginning to adapt. They quickly learned from their mistakes, and their adaptability would become one of their greatest strengths. Training intensified, and more seasoned veterans helped to guide the inexperienced recruits. The U.S. military began to understand the importance of not just strength, but coordination, flexibility, and quick thinking. By the time the U.S. forces were fully integrated into the European theater, they had become a force to be reckoned with, and their earlier struggles began to fade into history. As the war progressed, the U.S. military's ability to adapt and develop new tactics became one of the defining characteristics of their success. Initially, the American forces struggled with the intricacies of modern warfare, learning the hard lessons that only battle could teach. Yet, in a remarkably short time, they transformed their approach, developing tactics that would allow them to outmaneuver even the most experienced German troops. One of the key aspects of this rapid development was the integration of different branches of the military, infantry, artillery, armor, and air support, into a cohesive fighting force. The U.S. military learned quickly that no branch could operate in isolation. It was only by coordinating effectively across all divisions that they could achieve success on the battlefield. Tanks, for example, were no longer used in isolation, but were integrated with infantry to provide mutual support. Artillery and air support were used in tandem with ground troops to overwhelm German defenses. This multifaceted approach, which became known as combined arms, allowed the Americans to adapt quickly to the ever-changing dynamics of the battlefield. Furthermore, the Americans showed remarkable flexibility in their approach. They learned how to shift tactics on the fly, reacting to the changing realities of each battle. Whether it was launching surprise raids, executing rapid counterattacks, or employing unconventional strategies, the U.S. military demonstrated an ability to surprise the Germans at every turn. The adaptability of the American forces allowed them to exploit weaknesses in the German strategy, something that the Wehrmacht had not anticipated. This rapid evolution in American tactics would soon change the course of the war. The U.S. military was no longer seen as a disorganized, inexperienced force. They had become a flexible, coordinated, and highly effective fighting machine, one that could learn from its mistakes and adapt to any challenge thrown its way. The first time the officers of the Wehrmacht saw American tactics in action, it was a moment of profound disbelief. They had long held the belief that the U.S. military was an inexperienced, disorganized force, struggling to find its footing in the complex web of warfare. But in the heat of battle, this perception was violently shattered. The American forces, far from being the disjointed army they had anticipated, were proving to be a sophisticated and formidable adversary. One of the most striking moments for the Germans came during the Battle of Normandy. What was intended as a simple invasion quickly turned into a devastating display of American military coordination. The American forces launched their assault from land, sea, and air, creating an overwhelming force that the Germans were ill-prepared to counter. The precision with which the Americans executed the invasion was nothing short of shocking. The Wehrmacht officers, who had expected a disorganized landing, were stunned by the efficiency and effectiveness of the assault. For the first time, they saw the full extent of the American military's capabilities, and it was more than they had bargained for. But Normandy was just one example. The American forces repeatedly surprised the Germans with their strategic innovation and adaptability. The Battle of the Bulge, for example, demonstrated the Americans' ability to react swiftly and decisively, even when caught off guard by a surprise German offensive. In every confrontation, the Wehrmacht was forced to recognize that the Americans were no longer the amateurs they had once thought. The shock of facing an army that could seamlessly coordinate massive operations and execute complex strategies was a jarring blow to the German high command. The Wehrmacht officers were beginning to understand that their earlier overconfidence had been a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the resolve, ingenuity, and sheer will of the American forces, and it was a mistake that would cost them dearly as the war raged on. The success of the D-Day invasion marked a monumental shift in the dynamics of the war. It was not just the scale of the operation that left a lasting impression, but the flawless execution of the plan, which showcased the Americans' growing mastery of military coordination. The landings in Normandy were a display of synchronization between infantry, tanks, artillery, air support, and naval firepower. It was a complex operation that involved thousands of soldiers, aircraft, and ships, all moving in unison toward a single goal: to breach the German defenses and liberate Western Europe. The seamless integration of different military branches was a turning point. For the Americans, D-Day was not only a test of their ability to land on enemy soil, but a demonstration of their evolving combat expertise. The combination of coordinated airstrikes, precision artillery fire, and ground assaults proved to be an overwhelming force. The soldiers stormed the beaches under heavy fire, but the support from above and around them kept the German defenses in check. Every element of the military played a critical role, and their collective effort overwhelmed the enemy's defenses. For the Germans, this was a stark realization. They had always prided themselves on the superiority of their military tactics, but they had never seen such a comprehensive, multi-layered attack. The Wehrmacht had relied on strong, centralized defense lines, yet the American assault bypassed this strength through effective coordination across multiple fronts. The ability to combine infantry, armor, and air support into one unified force was a concept the Germans had not fully anticipated. What the Germans thought would be a simple defense against an uncoordinated invasion quickly turned into a nightmare. The success of D-Day also showcased the growing confidence and skill of the American forces. They were no longer just reacting to enemy movements. They were setting the pace, orchestrating their movements with precision. This skill would serve them in the battles to come, as the Americans continued to develop a reputation for coordination that would be essential to their success across the European theater. Can you imagine the shock of the German officers as they watched this level of coordination in action? How did they cope with the overwhelming force of this attack? The hallmark of the American military's success in World War II was not just their ability to fight, but their capacity for rapid adaptation and creative problem-solving. The Germans, accustomed to a rigid, hierarchical command structure, were often caught off guard by the flexibility and innovation the Americans brought to the battlefield. American tactics were characterized by their ability to quickly pivot, to move from one approach to another as circumstances evolved. This ability to remain fluid, to surprise the enemy, and to innovate in real time became one of their greatest strengths. One of the most remarkable aspects of American tactics was their use of surprise. Whether it was an unexpected counterattack, a raid on a seemingly fortified position, or an ambush in the dense forests of the Ardennes, the U.S. forces knew how to keep their enemies guessing. They understood that in modern warfare, it was not enough to simply be stronger or more organized than the enemy. Sometimes, it was about being unpredictable, throwing off the enemy's plans, making them react instead of act. This was perfectly demonstrated during the Battle of the Bulge, when American forces, initially overwhelmed by the surprise German offensive, quickly regrouped and turned the tables on their attackers. The Americans also proved themselves masters of unconventional warfare. From the use of specialized units like the Rangers and airborne divisions, to the development of new technologies and tactics, the U.S. military was unafraid to think outside the box. They adapted to the terrain, made use of the environment, and learned to fight not just on the battlefield, but within the larger context of modern war, where strategy often trumped sheer strength. It was this creative thinking, this ability to adapt, that allowed the U.S. forces to consistently overcome the Germans and others who underestimated their capabilities. For the Germans, facing an opponent who could change its tactics so quickly was unsettling. The Wehrmacht, which had relied on rigidly structured plans, found itself constantly reacting to a force that was unpredictable and creative. The Americans' ability to adapt, whether on the offensive or defensive, forced the Germans to play catch-up, unable to keep pace with the relentless creativity of their adversary. When was the last time you saw an army shift tactics so quickly, catching their enemy off guard? What would it have been like to face such an opponent? As the war drew closer to its end, one fundamental truth became increasingly clear. Strength alone would not determine the victor. While the German forces had some of the most advanced weaponry of the time, including the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks, it was not enough to guarantee their success. The U.S. military demonstrated that victory in war was not simply about possessing the most powerful weapons, but about the ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the enemy. In the face of these powerful German tanks, the Americans did not rely solely on superior firepower. Instead, they adapted quickly, utilizing coordinated tactics, intelligence, and sheer ingenuity to exploit weaknesses in the German lines. It was the strategic flexibility of the Americans, how they combined infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, that allowed them to overcome the seemingly insurmountable German advantage in firepower, the USASs. Army learned that in modern warfare, the key to victory was not just strength, but the ability to adapt to the situation at hand, to be creative, and to quickly change course when necessary. The Battle of the Bulge stands as a perfect example of this lesson. The Germans launched a surprise offensive, hoping to push back the American forces in a final, desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. But instead of folding under pressure, the U.S. forces regrouped quickly, exploited gaps in the German strategy, and launched a powerful counterattack. In doing so, they proved that resilience, adaptability, and the ability to think on the fly were just as important, if not more so, than having the most powerful weapon on the field. The war had taught a hard lesson to both sides. Victory was never guaranteed by the strength of arms alone. The Americans, with their ability to learn quickly and adapt, showed the world that military success came from strategy, coordination, and the willingness to embrace change. The lesson of World War II was that power in warfare could be fleeting, but the ability to adapt and innovate would always win the day. As the smoke of war lifted and the echoes of battle faded, a profound shift had taken place, not only in the course of history, but in the very nature of warfare itself. The lessons of World War II were etched into the fabric of every army that fought and every soldier who survived. Strength, power, and technological superiority, while important, were no longer the sole determinants of victory. The U.S. military, emerging from the shadow of an untested force, proved that adaptability, coordination, and the willingness to evolve could shift the tides of war. The transformation of the American forces from an inexperienced army to a well-coordinated, formidable fighting machine was nothing short of extraordinary. Each setback, each mistake, became a stepping stone toward an innovative and flexible strategy that caught the Germans off guard time and time again. This ability to learn from their failures and adapt quickly was perhaps the most important lesson the Americans imparted on the world. Success in warfare, and in life, often depends on how well we can adjust to the unexpected. For the Wehrmacht, the realization came too late. Their belief in their own superiority blinded them to the strength of their enemy. By the time they understood the true power of American ingenuity and coordination, the war had already shifted in the Allies' favor. The Americans, with their creativity, resilience, and ability to grow from every challenge, had proven that no matter how powerful the enemy, the will to adapt would always carry the day. As we reflect on this chapter of history, one can't help but think of the soldiers, both American and German, who lived and died by these lessons. The battlefield, once a place of destruction and chaos, became the stage for a lesson that transcended war itself. The true strength of any force, it seems, lies not in its weapons or its numbers, but in its ability to change, to grow, and to overcome.